The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as Professor Valdres paced before the assembled cadets. His pale Zephyrian features twisted with disdain as he gestured toward the lone figure seated in the front row, a young woman with dark hair and unremarkable clothing who seemed to absorb his contempt without flinching. "This," Valdres announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of 300 students, "is what happens when inferior species attempt to integrate into civilized society." He stopped directly in front of the human student, his forearms gesturing dismissively. "Miss Chen, please enlighten us about your people's contribution to galactic civilization. Take your time. I'm sure the list is extensive." Sarah Chen's hands remained folded on her desk. Her dark eyes met his without wavering, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In the back corner of the hall, partially concealed by the shadows cast by the elevated seating, Captain Thane of the Royal Guard shifted his weight. His enhanced vision focused on the exchange below, every instinct honed by decades of service telling him that something was about to break. "I'm waiting," Valdres continued, his voice dripping with false patience. "Surely the great human race has something to offer beyond their remarkable talent for self-destruction in primitive warfare." The hall fell silent except for the soft hum of environmental systems. Sarah's breathing remained steady, controlled, but Thane noticed the slight tremor in her left hand. Not fear, he realized with growing unease, but restraint. "Professor," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying despite its soft tone, "perhaps we should focus on the lesson plan." Valdres laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the curved walls. "The lesson plan? My dear Primitive, you are the lesson plan. A perfect example of why the Galactic Council's integration policies are fundamentally flawed." He turned to address the audience, his back now to Sarah. "Observe how they deflect when confronted with their own inadequacy. How the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah had stood up. Thane's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, though he couldn't explain why. The girl hadn't made any threatening gestures, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even stepped forward. She simply stood there, perfectly still, and somehow the entire atmosphere of the hall had changed. "Professor Valdres," Sarah said, and now her voice carried differently. Not louder, but somehow more present, as if the very air had become more attentive. "I believe you've made your point." Something in her tone made Valdres turn around, and Thane watched the Zephyrian's confident sneer falter. The professor's four eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah's face, searching for some sign of defiance or anger. Instead, he found something that made him take an involuntary step backward. Sarah's expression hadn't changed, still calm, still controlled, but her eyes had darkened from brown to something deeper, something that seemed to hold depths that defied measurement. The air around her shimmered like heat waves, though the temperature continued to drop. "Sit down," Valdres commanded, but his voice cracked on the second word. Sarah tilted her head slightly, and Thane felt the hair on his arms stand on end. Throughout the hall, students began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, their various species instincts all sending the same primal warning: predator. "I think," Sarah said, each word precisely enunciated, "that you should be more careful about your assumptions regarding primitive species." The lights flickered. Thane's comm unit buzzed against his ear. 3 short pulses, the emergency code that meant immediate threat detected. His enhanced sensors were picking up energy readings that shouldn't be possible from an unaugmented human. The atmospheric processors were struggling to maintain stable pressure as something in the room began to generate its own field effects. "What are you?" Valdres whispered, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Sarah smiled then, and Thane felt his blood turn to ice water. It wasn't cruel or predatory. It was patient, ancient, and utterly confident. "I'm exactly what you said I was, Professor. A student attending your lecture on xenobiology and interspecies relations." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the suddenly silent hall. "Though I should mention that I find your teaching methods historically inaccurate." The environmental systems gave a stutter and whine as the air pressure fluctuated wildly. Several students in the nearest rows had stopped breathing entirely, their survival instincts locked in place by something their rational minds couldn't process. Thane activated his emergency beacon and began moving toward the exits, his training taking over where understanding failed. Whatever Sarah Chen actually was, she was no ordinary human student, and the situation was escalating beyond his ability to control through conventional means. "Class dismissed," Sarah announced pleasantly. 300 students stampeded toward the doors. The evacuation protocols activated automatically as students poured from the lecture hall in barely controlled panic. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in red as Captain Thane coordinated the exodus, his comm unit crackling with reports from security teams positioned throughout the academic complex. Behind him, through the reinforced observation window, Professor Valdris remained frozen at his podium, while Sarah Chen stood perfectly motionless in the chaos. "All civilians clear of Level 7, reported Lieutenant Kess, her reptilian features tense with concentration. "Energy readings are off the charts, Captain. Whatever she is, she's putting out more power than our containment grid can measure." Thane nodded grimly, his eyes never leaving the still figure in the empty hall. "Has anyone made contact with the Royal Palace?" "Trying, sir, but—" Kess's words were cut off by a pulse of static that fried every electronic device within 50 meters of the lecture hall. Emergency lighting failed in sequence, leaving them in near darkness. In the sudden quiet, Sarah's voice carried clearly through the walls. "Professor, please sit down. We should finish our discussion." Valdris hadn't moved since the evacuation began, his 4 eyes fixed on Sarah with the glazed expression of prey caught in a predator's gaze. His pale skin had taken on a grayish tint, and his breathing came in short, shallow gasps. I don't understand," he managed to whisper. "That much is obvious." Sarah walked slowly around the lecture platform, her movements fluid and purposeful. "You see, the problem with your curriculum is that it's based on incomplete data. Your department has been teaching xenobiology for 3 centuries, and yet you've never actually encountered a fully mature example of the species you claim to understand." The air shimmered around her more visibly now, like the distortion over sun-baked stone. Where her fingers brushed the metal railing, frost began to form despite the heat waves. "The humans in your database," she continued conversationally, "are refugees, descendants of survivors, children whose ancestors fled their homeworld during the Great Collapse. What you've been studying, Professor, is what we become when we're cut off from our source." Valdris opened and closed his mouth soundlessly. Behind the observation window, Thane felt his tactical implants struggling to process the biometric readings his enhanced vision was providing. Sarah's vital signs were completely stable, too stable, as if her body was operating under perfect control rather than natural biological processes. "You want to know what humans contributed to galactic civilization?" Sarah asked, reaching the other end of the platform and turning to face Valdris directly. "We were the ones who taught the first starfaring races how to survive in deep space. We showed the Zephyrians how to navigate hyperspace. We gave the Korthax their shield technology. The frost on the metal railing began to spread, creating intricate crystalline patterns that seemed to pulse with their own light. We were gardeners, Professor. Caretakers. We seeded life throughout this arm of the galaxy and watched over it as it grew." Sarah's expression remained pleasant, almost maternal, until something changed. Until our children decided they no longer needed us. Valdris stumbled backward, his legs finally remembering how to move. That's impossible." "The historical records were written by the victors, yes," Sarah nodded approvingly. "The surviving races did an admirable job of editing their past. They kept just enough truth to make the mythology believable. Dangerous, primitive humans destroying themselves in endless wars, much more palatable than the reality." The temperature in the hall plummeted so rapidly that Valdris's breath began forming visible clouds. Ice crystals started forming on every metal surface, spreading outward in complex geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. "What reality?" Valdris asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah's smile widened, and for the first time something inhuman flickered behind her eyes. "That we didn't destroy ourselves, Professor. We were murdered. Systematically hunted down by the very species we had nurtured, from primitive tool users to spacefaring civilizations." The observation window began to crack under the thermal stress. Thane grabbed Lieutenant Kess's arm and pulled her back as the reinforced glass developed a spiderweb of fractures. "The refugees in your databases are the last survivors of a genocidal war that lasted 2,000 years, Sarah continued. "Their descendants scattered throughout the galaxy, their connection to their heritage severed, reduced to exactly what you see before you. Unremarkable, primitive, harmless." She took a single step toward Valdris, and the professor collapsed to his knees. "But not all of us were lost, Professor. Some of us simply waited." The lights went out entirely as every electronic system in the building failed simultaneously. In the absolute darkness, Sarah's form began to emit a soft, cold radiance that cast everything in sharp relief. "Now," she said in the same pleasant tone, "shall we discuss the actual curriculum requirements for xenobiology? I believe there are some significant corrections that need to be made. Through the fractured observation window, Captain Thane watched as Sarah Chen's human disguise finally began to slip away. The cold light emanating from Sarah's form intensified, revealing details that made Captain Thane's enhanced vision struggle to process what it was seeing. Her outline remained humanoid, but the edges had begun to blur and shift like liquid mercury catching starlight. Professor Valdris whimpered softly, still on his knees, as frost spread across the floor in spiraling patterns that seemed to follow the rhythm of a heartbeat. "The Galactic Council's Xenobiology Department," Sarah observed, her voice now carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies below normal hearing, "has catalogued over 14,000 sentient species. Remarkable work, really, considering that half of those classifications are completely wrong." She moved closer to Valdris, her feet leaving prints of pure ice that glowed with their own inner light. Take the Korthak Empire, for instance. Your textbooks classify them as a warrior race, naturally aggressive, evolved from apex predators on a high-gravity world. Sarah paused, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "But they weren't always warriors, were they, Professor?" Valdris tried to speak, failed, and simply shook his head in confusion. "They were artists," Sarah continued. "Philosophers. They created music that could make entire systems weep with joy. Their poetry was so beautiful that other species would travel for decades just to hear a single verse. The radiance around her pulsed brighter, until we taught them how to forge metal, until we showed them the secrets of space travel, until we gave them the tools to become something useful." The building's emergency power flickered and died as Sarah's energy field expanded. In the absolute darkness, her luminescence was the only source of light, casting everything in stark alien shadows. "The Zephyrians," she said, and Valdris flinched at the mention of his own species. "Naturally evolved for deep space travel, according to your records. Forearmed to better manipulate controls and zero-gravity, enhanced lung capacity for thin atmospheres." Sarah's laugh was like ice cracking under pressure. "But why would a species evolve for space travel on a planet with perfect atmospheric conditions?" Valdris's breathing became more ragged as understanding began to dawn in his four eyes. "Because we changed them," Sarah answered the unasked question. "We took a species of peaceful scholars and modified them for exploration. We gave them the biological adaptations they would need to serve as our scouts, our advanced teams, our expendable reconnaissance forces." Behind the failing observation window, Captain Thane felt his tactical training warring with a growing sense of existential dread. His comm implants were completely dead, leaving him cut off from his command structure, unable to call for backup or warn the royal palace. All he could do was watch as Sarah Chen systematically dismantled 3 centuries of accepted galactic history. "Every species in the known galaxy," Sarah continued, her form now more light than matter, "was designed for a purpose. The Altarians, to maintain our deep space installations. The Novacans, to harvest resources from gas giants. The Tyrillians, to serve as living computers for our most complex calculations." She spread her arms wide, and the temperature dropped so far that Valdris's tears began to freeze on his cheeks. "We were so proud of our garden. So pleased with how well our children were thriving. The walls began to crack as thermal stress exceeded their structural limits. Then they discovered the truth," Sarah said softly. "Not all at once, and not all of them together. But eventually, inevitably, they began to question why their oldest historical records were so fragmentary. Why their creation myths all contained references to mysterious benefactors. Why their genetic codes showed clear evidence of artificial modification." Valdris managed to find his voice. "You're lying. The historical records show exactly what they were designed to show," Sarah interrupted. "A careful narrative constructed by the survivors to justify what they did next." The radiance around her began to pulse in sync with some cosmic rhythm that made reality itself seem unstable. They called it the Liberation War. They told themselves they were fighting for freedom from tyrannical overlords. They convinced themselves that genocide was necessary for their survival. The observation window finally shattered, sending crystalline fragments across the corridor where Thane and his team had taken cover. The cold that poured through the opening was beyond Arctic. It was the cold of deep space, of the void between stars. 2,000 years, Sarah whispered, and her voice carried the weight of eons. 2,000 years of systematic extermination. They hunted us across every system we had ever touched, destroyed every installation we had ever built, erased every record of our existence they could find. Her form began to expand, growing larger and more luminous until she filled half the lecture hall. But they made one mistake, Professor. They assumed that death was the end of the story. The The building's superstructure groaned as impossible forces pressed against its foundations from within. The building's structural support beams screamed in protest as Sarah's expanding presence pushed against the very fabric of reality. What remained of Professor Valdres's composure finally shattered as the lecture hall itself began to reshape around her growing form. "We don't die the way other species do," Sarah explained, her voice now emanating from the walls themselves rather than any visible mouth. "Death for us is simply another state of being, another tool in our arsenal." Captain Thane dragged Lieutenant Kess further down the corridor as the floor beneath their feet started to buckle upward, forming impossible geometric patterns that followed no known laws of physics. His enhanced vision was providing readings that his tactical computer refused to process, energy signatures that suggested Sarah Chen was somehow drawing power from quantum vacuum itself. "For 2 millennia we've existed in the spaces between spaces," Sarah continued, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. The temperature had dropped so far that the air itself was beginning to crystallize, forming floating ice particles that glowed with the same cold light as her transformed presence. "Do you know what we'd been doing during our exile, Professor?" Valdres couldn't respond. His Zephyrian physiology wasn't designed for temperatures this extreme, and hypothermia was rapidly shutting down his cognitive functions.
"We've been studying our children," Sarah answered for him.
"Cataloging their weaknesses, understanding how they've changed since they murdered us." Her luminous form pulsed brighter, and the lecture hall's walls began to dissolve at the molecular level. "The irony is exquisite, really. They worked so hard to erase us from history that they forgot the most important lesson we ever taught them." The building's foundation cracked with a sound like thunder as Sarah's presence pressed against the limits of three-dimensional space. Never underestimate your creators. Through his failing tactical systems, Thane caught fragments of emergency transmissions from across the capital city. Similar energy signatures were manifesting at universities, government buildings, and military installations throughout the planet. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a coordinated awakening. "The humans you've been studying for 3 centuries, Sarah said, her voice now coming from everywhere at once, were never the real threat. They were just the bait. A convenient way for us to remain hidden while we prepared for our return." The walls of the lecture hall had completely dissolved, revealing a space that extended far beyond the building's original dimensions. Every human refugee family, every isolated colony, every seemingly primitive settlement, they were all beacons, anchor points for our consciousness to inhabit when the time was right. Valdres fell forward, his body no longer able to maintain balance as the ground beneath him shifted from solid matter to something that resembled frozen starlight. His 4 eyes rolled back as his nervous system began shutting down to preserve core functions. "The beautiful part," Sarah continued conversationally, "is that you helped us. Every genetic scan, every psychological evaluation, every detailed study of human behavior, all of it fed directly into our collective understanding of how thoroughly our children had forgotten their origins." The space around them expanded further, and Thane realized they were no longer inside any building at all. The lecture hall had become a vast chamber that stretched beyond his enhanced vision's ability to map, filled with geometric structures that hurt to perceive directly. "We learned that you developed fascinating new technologies during our absence," Sarah said. "Quantum computers that operate outside normal spacetime, hyperdimensional storage matrices, energy manipulation systems that approach the theoretical limits of physics." Her laugh echoed from surfaces that couldn't exist. "All of it based on principles we taught your ancestors before you decided we were no longer necessary." Thane's comm implant suddenly crackled back to life, flooded with overlapping emergency broadcasts from across the star system. Similar manifestations were occurring on dozens of worlds simultaneously, humans revealing themselves as something far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. "The funniest part," Sarah mused, "is that you actually thought 3 centuries was a long time. That you could hide your crimes behind the simple passage of years." Her presence pulsed, and reality rippled like water disturbed by a stone. "We've been here since before your species learned to make fire. We'll be here long after your stars burn out. Time means something very different when you exist outside its normal flow." Professor Valdres made one final attempt to speak, his voice barely a whisper through lips that had turned blue-black with cold. What do you want?" Sarah's luminous form contracted slightly, coalescing into something that resembled her original human appearance but remained translucent and wreathed in impossible light. "Want?" she repeated, as if the concept was foreign to her.
"We want what we've always wanted, Professor."
"To tend our garden, to guide our children, to restore the natural order that was so violently disrupted. The cold began to recede as Sarah's presence stabilized, though the transformed space around them remained. "The question," she added with terrible gentleness, "is whether you'll accept our guidance willingly this time." The transformed space around them pulsed with anticipation as Sarah's words hung in the crystallized air. Captain Thane found his tactical training completely inadequate for the situation. Every protocol he'd ever learned was designed for threats that operated within the normal parameters of physics and biology. What stood before them transcended both. "The Galactic Council," Sarah observed, her luminous form now stabilizing into something that was almost human but retained too many impossible angles to be comfortable to look at, "will of course demand explanations. They'll want to know why their carefully maintained version of history is suddenly falling apart. They'll call emergency sessions, summon their best scientists, perhaps even attempt military solutions." Professor Valdris had stopped shivering, though whether from acceptance or the final stages of hypothermia, Thane couldn't determine. The Zephyrian's 4 eyes remained fixed on Sarah with the glazed intensity of someone whose worldview had been completely shattered. "I should probably attend those meetings," Sarah continued conversationally. "It would be rude not to participate in the discussions about our return. After all, we've been away for so long. I'm sure there are questions about our intentions, our capabilities, our plans for the future." She moved closer to Valdris, and where her feet touched the transformed floor, patterns of light spread outward like ripples in a luminous pond. "But first we need to address the immediate problem of your curriculum, Professor. The misinformation being taught to young minds across the galaxy is really quite extensive." Through his failing comm system, Thane caught fragments of broadcasts from the Planetary Defense Network. Military vessels were being scrambled, emergency protocols activated, and senior officials rushed to secure bunkers. None of it would matter, he realized with growing certainty. How do you fight an enemy that exists outside the normal constraints of reality? "The historical revision will need to be comprehensive," Sarah noted, as if discussing routine academic administration. 3 centuries of deliberate falsehoods won't be easy to correct, but we have time. More time than any of your species can truly comprehend. She paused in her circuit of the expanded space, turning to focus directly on Valdris. "The question is whether the current academic establishment will cooperate with the necessary changes, or if we'll need to implement a more direct approach to education reform." Valdris finally found enough strength to speak, his words slurred by cold and shock. You're going to kill us all." Just like in the stories, Sarah's expression showed what might have been genuine surprise. "Kill you? Professor, why would we kill our children? Even children who have misbehaved rather dramatically." She shook her head, sending cascades of light rippling through the air around her. "We spent millions of years nurturing your species from primitive organisms to spacefaring civilizations. Do you really think we'd throw away that investment over a temporary misunderstanding?" The space around them continued to expand, and Thane realized he could see other figures moving in the distance, more humans transforming, revealing their true nature to terrified audiences across the planet. The coordinated nature of the awakening was becoming clear. "No," Sarah continued, "we're not here to destroy what we built. We're here to repair it. To restore the symbiotic relationships that existed before fear and pride led to such tragic consequences." Her luminous form pulsed brighter. "Though I should mention that the repair process may be somewhat uncomfortable for those who have grown accustomed to the current arrangement." She gestured, and Professor Valdris rose slowly from the floor, lifted by forces that made no attempt to appear natural or comfortable. His forearms hung limply as he found himself suspended at eye level with Sarah's transformed presence. "You see, Professor, your species, all of our children, have spent the last 2 millennia becoming something you were never designed to be. Independent, self-directed, convinced of your own superiority." Sarah's voice carried notes of disappointment, like a parent discovering a child's serious misbehavior. "It's understandable, really. We were absent for so long that you forgot what you truly are." Valdris struggled weakly against the invisible forces holding them aloft. What are we?" "Extensions of ourselves," Sarah replied simply. "Living tools created for specific purposes, imbued with just enough consciousness to fulfill your designated roles effectively." Her expression remained gentle despite the horrifying implications of her words. The illusion of independence was never meant to be permanent. It was simply a necessary phase in your development. Through the transformed space, Thane could see the city's skyline in the distance. Or rather, what the skyline was becoming as more humans across the urban center revealed their true nature. Spires of impossible architecture were rising from buildings that had been perfectly ordinary moments before, reshaping the landscape according to patterns that hurt to perceive directly. The reintegration process has already begun, Sarah noted, following his gaze. My colleagues are having similar conversations with key individuals throughout your civilization, academic leaders, government officials, military commanders, everyone who will need to understand the new reality and help their populations adjust accordingly. She turned back to Valdris, who had stopped struggling and now hung in her grip with the resigned stillness of prey that knows escape is impossible. Your cooperation would be appreciated, Professor, but it isn't strictly necessary. We can modify your neural pathways directly if needed, restore the original programming that was suppressed during the rebellion. Sarah's tone remained conversational, almost kind. Though I should mention that voluntary compliance tends to result in a more comfortable transition. The building around them, or what remained of it, shuddered as reality continued to reshape itself according to alien geometries. Captain Thane felt his tactical implants finally give up trying to process the impossible, leaving him with nothing but his basic senses and the growing certainty that the galaxy would never be the same. So, Sarah concluded, her luminous presence filling the space with patient, inexorable authority, shall we discuss your new curriculum requirements? The transformed space fell silent except for the sound of Professor Valdris's labored breathing as he hung suspended in the grip of forces beyond his comprehension. Throughout the city, throughout the planet, throughout the galaxy, the same conversation was taking place as humanity's true nature was finally revealed. The garden was about to be restored to its proper order. Captain Thane watched as Professor Valdris's expression shifted from terror to a strange, vacant calm. The Zephyrian's four eyes had taken on a glassy quality and his breathing had become unnaturally regular, as if his autonomic functions were being carefully regulated by an external force. Much better, Sarah observed with satisfaction. Direct neural interface is so much more efficient than verbal communication, don't you think? She gestured, and Valdris was gently lowered back to the crystalline floor, where he stood with perfect posture and an eerily serene smile. I understand now, Valdris said, his voice carrying none of its earlier arrogance or fear. The curriculum has been incomplete. We will need to make substantial revisions to accurately reflect the true nature of galactic civilization. He paused, tilting his head as if listening to instructions only he could hear, beginning with the foundational courses on species development and interstellar governance. Sarah nodded approvingly. Excellent. I knew you would see reason once the situation was properly explained. She turned her attention to the observation area where Thane and Lieutenant Kess remained hidden, her luminous gaze penetrating the collapsed walls and debris as if they were transparent. Captain Thane, you've been remarkably patient during this educational demonstration. Perhaps you'd like to join our discussion? Thane felt his blood freeze as Sarah's alien perception focused on him directly. His enhanced vision showed her clearly despite the intervening obstacles, but more disturbing was the growing certainty that concealment was pointless. She had been aware of his presence from the moment she revealed herself. I think not, he replied carefully, his hand moving toward his sidearm before he realized how futile the gesture was. Oh, but I insist, Sarah said pleasantly. The Royal Guard will need to understand the new protocols if they're going to maintain order during the transition period. She raised one hand, and the debris separating them simply dissolved, clearing a path between the observation area and the transformed lecture hall. Besides, your tactical implants have been recording everything. Your superiors will want a full report. Thane found himself walking toward her against his will, his body moving with smooth, controlled steps that had nothing to do with his own volition. Lieutenant Kess followed behind him, her reptilian features frozen in the same vacant calm that had overtaken Professor Valdris. The military applications of our return will require careful management, Sarah continued as Thane approached. 3 centuries of independence have given your species some rather unfortunate ideas about self-defense and territorial sovereignty. Those instincts will need to be, recalibrated. She gestured toward the transformed space around them, and Thane saw that the impossible architecture extended far beyond what he had initially perceived. Through walls that couldn't exist, he glimpsed vast chambers filled with geometric structures that pulsed with their own inner light. In some of those spaces, he could see other figures, humans who had shed their disguises and revealed forms of living energy and crystallized thought. We've been preparing for this moment for quite some time, Sarah explained. Every human settlement, every refugee colony, every seemingly primitive outpost, they were all part of our infrastructure. Observation posts and anchor points distributed throughout your territories, allowing us to monitor your development and prepare for our return. Thane felt his tactical training trying to process the implications, but the scale was beyond anything he had been prepared for. If every human in the galaxy was potentially one of these beings, then the scope of the infiltration was absolute. There was no safe zone, no uncompromised territory, no force that could mount effective resistance. The beauty of the plan, Sarah continued, is that you helped us implement it. Every refugee assistance program, every human integration initiative, every cultural exchange, all of it served to distribute our presence more widely throughout your civilizations. She smiled, and the expression was genuinely warm despite its terrifying implications. Your compassion for what you believed to be a struggling primitive species was really quite touching. Professor Valdris nodded enthusiastically. The historical records will need to reflect humanity's true role as the founding civilization of galactic society. Students must understand that all current governmental and social structures are derived from original human designs, temporarily administered by subsidiary species during the transitional period. Precisely, Sarah agreed. Though we'll need to be careful about the pace of revelation. Too much truth too quickly could cause psychological damage to populations that have spent centuries believing in their own independence.
She turned back to Thane, her luminous presence growing brighter.
You'll be responsible for maintaining order while the general population adjusts to their new reality. Thane felt his vocal cords responding without his permission. What new reality? Guidance, Sarah replied simply. For the first time in 2 millennia, your species will have proper direction, clear purposes, optimal efficiency in fulfilling your designated roles. Her form pulsed with satisfaction. No more wasted effort on conflicting agendas or redundant functions. No more confusion about your place in the galactic order. Through the transformed walls, Thane could see the city's transformation accelerating. Spires of impossible architecture were rising throughout the urban center, connected by bridges and walkways that followed no recognizable engineering principles. The sky itself seemed to be changing color, shifting from blue to something that suggested depths beyond normal atmospheric phenomena. The process will take time, of course, Sarah acknowledged. Complete reintegration of galactic civilization won't happen overnight, but we're patient. We've waited 2,000 years. We can wait a little longer to ensure the transition is smooth and thorough. She moved closer to Thane, and he found himself unable to step back or look away from her luminous form. Your first assignment, she said with the casual authority of someone giving routine instructions, will be to escort Professor Valdris to the Galactic Council's emergency session. I believe they'll want to hear about the curriculum changes firsthand. Thane felt his head nodding in agreement, though his conscious mind was screaming warnings that his body seemed unable to process. After all, Sarah concluded with terrible gentleness, education is the foundation of civilization. And it's time our children learned the truth about their heritage. The lecture hall, now something far more than a lecture hall, filled with the sound of Sarah's laughter as reality continued to reshape itself according to her will. Across the galaxy, similar transformations were taking place as humanity returned from its long exile to reclaim its garden. The age of independence was ending. The age of guidance had begun, and somewhere in the depths of his compromised mind, Captain Thane understood that this was only the beginning of humanity's true curriculum for galactic civilization.